Hi everyone, my name is Shreya Sriram and I'm an MCAT tutor at Shemasian Academic Consulting. Today I'll be walking through a CARS passage, so thank you so much for joining me. This should typically take you about 9 minutes, but I'll be walking and talking through it, so it'll be taking a little bit longer. But thanks again for being here and let's get started. All right, so with this passage or any passage that I do on the MCAT, if it's for practice, you want to act like you're taking it for the exam. That's my number one strategy or tip is that whenever you do MCAT practice, you always want to be in the zone. So simulating those test day conditions as best as you can will help you when actual exam day comes around because you'll already be so used to being in that groove, and you'll be able to take on any distractions or curveballs that come on exam day a lot better. So that's my number one rule and tip of all time. But let's get right into CARS. So for CARS specifically, I like to focus on two main things. So the first one is I always like to look at the tone of the author. And I do this because that helps you understand the author's argument a lot better. And that's the main goal, right? In any CARS passage is to be able to really understand what the author is saying, what the topic of the CARS passage is, and how they feel about that. So, hand in hand with that is really understanding the tone of the author. And something that really helps you understand the tone is always figuring out a way to simplify what it is that the author is saying. So a lot of these MCAT CARS passages can be very complex. They can be very convoluted. They can use, really archaic phrases that make it hard to understand what the passage is saying. But if you have that reminder in your head to always be simplifying, always try and get it to, for lack of a better term, layman's words, you can really understand the core argument of the passage a lot better, and that'll help you when you're answering the question. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the passage with these two reminders in mind. I'm going to be reading it out loud and highlighting as I go along, and hopefully you'll be able to understand from my explanation why I highlight what I do. And then we'll go through the questions and answer them together using some CAR strategies. So let's jump right in. Okay, so the Ion is the shortest, or nearly the shortest, of all the writings which bear the name of Plato, and is not authenticated by any external testimony. The grace and beauty of this little work supply the only and perhaps the sufficient proof of its genuineness. The plan is simple. The dramatic interest consists entirely in the contrast between the irony of Socrates and the transparent vanity and childlike enthusiasm of the rhapsode Ion, the performer who recites the Homeric writings. The theme of the dialogue may possibly have been suggested by the passage of Xenophon's Memorabilia, in which the rhapsodists are described by Euthydemus as very precise about the exact words of Homer, but very idiotic themselves. Okay, so with every CARS passage, after every paragraph, I like to just take a couple seconds and consolidate everything that I've just read and write a couple word summary of what the main idea of that passage is and maybe what the author is trying to say. So for this paragraph, I would probably identify who our main players are so far. So we have Socrates, seems to be contrasting, I like this word, seems to be at odds with the Ion. So whenever I do CARS passages, remember we want to simplify. So that also means simplifying in how I write about the paragraphs. So I'm going to use a symbol. Socrates is in contrast or kind of fighting with Ion. And Socrates is he's kind of a philosopher. Ion is a rhapsode. It doesn't really seem like anything else important has been said here. So really that's what I'm taking away from the Socrates is in contrast with Ion, who recites Homer. So we can put it into context. Okay, very bad handwriting. Let's try that again. Recites Homer. Okay, Great. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Ion the rhapsode has just come to Athens. He has been exhibiting in Epidaurus at the festival of Asclepius and is intending to exhibit at the festival of the Panathenea. Socrates admires and envies the rhapsode's art. Okay, that seems important. For he is always well dressed and in good company, in the company of good poets and of Homer, who is the prince of them. In the course of conversation, the admission is elicited from Ion that his skill is restricted to Homer and that he knows nothing of inferior poets such as Hesiod and Archilochus. He brightens up and is wide awake when Homer is being recited, but is apt to go to sleep at the recitations of any other poet. Okay, so here we have a bit more information on Socrates and Ion and a little bit more about Ion's art. So it seems like Ion loves Homer and doesn't like bad poets and maybe poetry even. Okay, so that's the main idea of what I've gleaned from this paragraph. I do want to bring to your attention why I highlighted this part, because it's giving us a bit more information on Socrates' feelings towards Ion. While I don't think that's important to mention in this, little paragraph summary that we're writing, I do want to just kind of keep that in mind, add that to the tone of the whole passage, that maybe Socrates and Ion, just adding more to the concept that we identified in the first paragraph, which is that Socrates and Ion seem to be at odds a little bit. And so that's just a little bit more context for that first idea that we identified. All right, moving on. And yet, surely, he who knows the superior ought to know the inferior also. He who can judge of the good speaker is able to judge of the bad, and poetry as a whole. And he who judges of poetry by rules of art ought to be able to judge all poetry. This is confirmed by the analogy of sculpture, painting, flute playing, and the other arts. The argument is at last brought home to the mind of Ion, who asks how this contradiction is to be solved. So what I would identify here as the main idea of this paragraph is that Ion contradiction knows good but not bad. So here we've identified the main player in this contradiction. It's Ion. What is the nature of this scenario? It is a contradiction. And what is that contradiction is that he knows the good, but he doesn't know the bad. And this is at odds with this philosophy that Socrates seems to have identified, is that if you know good poetry, judge of good poetry is also able to be the judge of the bad. All right, let's keep moving on. The solution given by Socrates is as follows. The rhapsode is not guided by rules of art, but is an inspired person who derives mysterious power from the poet. And the poet, in like manner, is inspired by the god. The poets and their interpreters may be compared to a chain of magnetic rings suspended from one another and from a magnet. The magnet is the muse, and the ring which immediately follows is the poet himself. For from him are suspended other poets. There's also a chain of rhapsodes and actors who also hang from the muses, but are let down at the side. The last ring of all is the spectator. The poet is the inspired interpreter of the god. Okay. And this is the reason why some poets like Homer are restricted to a single theme, or like Tynnichus are famous for a single poem. And the rhapsode is the inspired interpreter of the poet. And for a similar reason, some rhapsodes like Ion are the interpreters of single poets. Okay, so I wanted to really get at that last, kind of sentence or so here, because this seems to be answering a contradiction. It really just mainly talks about how this is honestly, I would write this as a little note, maybe in place of the paragraph summary, is that the order seems to be God, poet, rhapsode, and then audience. And that seems to be a really one-to-one connection, and that's how Socrates is basically justifying Rhapsode's individual attention and care for Homer's poetry, is that maybe this God to poet and poet to rhapsode connection is one-to-one. And so that's just to note how I would visually describe this for myself. I'm a very visual learner, so I like to incorporate diagrams and flow charts and pathways similar to what you might see on the biochem section in the cars section as well. And that's always a strategy that you can use. Some people like to write it out in words as a little summary. I like to use diagrams and symbols and equations and stuff like that. And so this is just how I see it. This is Socrates's explanation in the previous paragraph, and that's what I see as the main idea for that previous paragraph. All right, close to the end here. So Ion is delighted at the notion of being inspired and acknowledges that he is beside himself when he's performing. His eyes rain tears and his hair stands on end. Socrates is of opinion that a man must be mad who behaves in this way at a festival when he's surrounded by his friends and there is nothing to trouble him. So here's Socrates' opinion. I want to highlight that again. Man must be mad who behaves in this way. Ion is confident that Socrates would never think him mad if he could only hear his embellishments of Homer. Socrates asks whether he can speak well about everything in Homer. Yes, indeed, he can. What about things of which he has no knowledge? Ion answers that he can interpret anything in Homer. All right, so that's the whole passage. And this last paragraph here, I really just think it's, what I highlighted, that seems to be the main kind of new information that was introduced in this paragraph, is that Socrates, again, this contradiction with Homer, he, in the beginning, he envied him. He also was there's just kind of like this, what do they say at the start? There's a contrast between the irony of Socrates and the childlike enthusiasm of Ion. So again, driving that home, Socrates and Ion thinks he's mad, or thinks performance is mad. So again, kind of finding that common thread throughout the entire Cars passage will be really helpful for you. In this one, it seemed to be that there's just this real contradiction and contrast between Socrates and Ion, and it evolves throughout the passage, and eventually it kind of ends on that as well. So that's a really good thread to pick up on, and it really helps you put the entire passage into context. And so that's honestly, if I were to summarize this whole passage just before I go into the questions to ground myself a little, it would be Socrates, contrast with the Ion, and then also talking about this other perspective that was discussed mainly in the middle here, about judging good versus bad. So this is going to be my main idea. And it's always helpful to have a little bit of a main idea written down when you're going into the questions, because that'll help you have that anchor for when you're deciding what answer choices to choose from. Sometimes in the moment, something can seem really right, but you read your main idea and it's set and it looks like it has nothing to do with it. So you always want to make sure you're drawing it back to what you figured out was the main idea when you were reading the passage. All right, so let's go on to the questions now. So number one, according to the passage, the author is most likely to agree with which of the following statements? A, Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. B, Ion believes that Hesiod and Archilochus have potential to be great poets, but they have not yet maximized that potential. C, Socrates believes he's a better rhapsode than Ion. D, Ion can only speak when Homer is physically present. All right, so this looks like it's an according to the passage question, and it's talking about the author is most likely to agree. And so immediately for questions like this, where it's kind of directing you to go back to the passage and it's asking for the author's perspective, what I like to do is read the answer choices and then think about where I saw that in the passage and try to read around it, find context, and determine whether or not it's supported by the passage. So for A, Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. So I remember we did write that down in our main ideas, judging good from bad. I'm going to try and remember where I saw that in the passage. Looks like it's in paragraph 2 here. So it says, And yet surely he who knows the superior ought to know the inferior. Also, he who can judge of the good speaker is able to judge of the bad. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, I don't think the rest of the paragraph is more about that concept, but I want more context into what the answer choice is showing me. It's showing me Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. So let's go back to where they talk about Ion, and I believe that was actually the paragraph right before it. So zooming in here, it looks like in this last Ion that his skill is restricted to Homer and that he knows nothing of inferior poets such as Hesiod and Archilochus. He brightens up and is wide awake when Homer is being recited. So clearly it looks like Ion does have an opinion. He knows who's inferior, supposedly Hesiod and Archilochus. He knows whose superiors are Homer. So he's able to make that distinction between who he deems as a good speaker and a bad speaker. So that doesn't seem wrong. I'm not going to cross out A just yet. B, Ion believes that Hesiod and Archilochus have potential to be great poets, but they have not yet maximized that potential. So back to where we saw Hesiod and Archilochus, looks like they were only mentioned in this paragraph here. And the context of that is that Ion knows nothing of these inferior poets such as Hesiod and Archilochus, and then goes on to brighten up and awake when Homer is being recited. At no point does he ever say that he thinks these poets can improve. He just doesn't really think that they're very good poets. So it doesn't seem like B is supported by any passage evidence, so we can cross that out. C, Socrates believes he's a better rhapsode than Ion. All right, so this does seem to introduce some idea of Socrates being at odds with Ion, so kind of that they're fighting, they're not really good friends, they're at contrast with each other. But at any point, does Socrates ever compare his own rhapsodic abilities with Ion? Let's see. Doesn't really seem, even in the first paragraph, between the irony of Socrates and the transparent vanity and childlike enthusiasm of the rhapsode Ion. And even here, Socrates admires and envies the rhapsode's art. So it doesn't seem like he thinks he's better. He actually does think Ion is a pretty good rhapsode. He's envious of it and he admires it. So I don't think he's thinking that he's better than Ion. Doesn't seem like there's passage evidence for that. And then D, Ion can only speak when Homer is physically present. So let's see. It says, I remember thinking about Homer and his company with Ion here in paragraph 2. So for he's always well dressed and in good company, in the company of good poets and of Homer, who is the prince of them. His skill is restricted to Homer. He brightens up and is wide awake when Homer is being recited, but is asleep at the recitations of any other poet. So it doesn't seem like Ion's own ability is restricted to when Homer is present. It just seems like he really likes Homer's poetry, and he likes to recite it, and he's often with Homer and Homer's friends, but nothing about his abilities being restricted to when Homer is present. So D can be crossed out, and that cements A as our answer. Okay, number 2. In paragraph 3, the author uses an analogy in order to, okay, so as soon as the question has identified a paragraph and the concept, they're looking at a paragraph and a concept, analogy, I'm going to go directly back to the paragraph before I even read the answer choices. So reading back to paragraph 3, I'm going to scan it quickly, look at what I highlighted. The judge of the good speaker is able to judge of the bad. This is confirmed by the analogy of sculpture, painting, flute playing, and the other arts. And then what I highlighted here, the argument is at last brought home to the mind of Ion, who asks how this contradiction is to be solved. Okay, so before I even read the answer choices, I want to predict what I think could be the answer to this question. So the question was asking why the analogy was there. And it seems like the analogy was really brought in just to confirm this contradiction that was later introduced. The analogy was there to kind of bring credibility to this contradiction that they were discussing later on. So let's see if there's anything that's similar to that. A, reinforce Homer's status as a preeminent poet. Didn't really seem to have to do anything with that. Really was focused around, cementing why that contradiction was salient, why it was important. So B, dispel the notion that Ion is a bad judge. So it didn't have anything to do with Ion's judging capability. It was more just about the contradiction of being able to judge between good and bad, and the fact that you kind of need to be able to find that distinction between the two and be familiar with both works. Okay, so C, suggest that Hesiod's work is misunderstood. The analogy didn't really have anything to do with Hesiod's work, wasn't really mentioned at all, so we can cross that out. D, present a dispute that will be resolved. So this sounds more like it, right? Because the contradiction was the dispute that this question is, this answer choice is discussing about this idea between good and bad. What does that mean to be able to judge good and bad works? And why is it that Ion falls asleep at bad works? Does that mean that he can't judge good and bad? And later they do go on to resolve this contradiction in the next paragraph. So that seems to be the purpose for that analogy. All right, question 3. Suppose a rhapsode screams, cries, and jumps during a performance. According to the passage, Socrates is most likely to think that the, all right, A, performer is treating the piece properly. B, performance is inspired. C, performer is crazy. D, performance is uninteresting. Okay, so I'm trying to think of when in the passage they talked about these sorts of very expressive performance, and I believe that was towards the end there, where they talk about Ion is delighted at the notion of being inspired and acknowledges that he is beside himself when he's performing. His eyes rain tears and his hair stands on end. Okay, what did I highlight here? Remember, I always want to read what I highlighted because I probably thought it was important if I highlighted it. Socrates is of the opinion that a man must be mad who behaves in this way at a festival when he is surrounded by his friends. Okay, so looks like we have come down to what this question is asking about. When someone is beside themselves, when they perform like this, Socrates thinks that they are mad. So now I'm going to, again, I've predicted that the answer choice might have something to do with being mad. I'm going to read and find if there's one that aligns with that. So A, performers treating the piece properly. It doesn't really sound like Socrates felt like they were treating the piece properly. B, performance is inspired. While Rhapsode is inspired, and Socrates was saying that in reference to Rhapsode, Socrates doesn't believe they're inspired. Socrates believes they must be mad. So not B. C, performer is crazy. So that sounds more like it. Crazy, mad, those are all words Socrates would probably use, but I'm going to read D just to make sure. Okay, D, performance is uninteresting. Well, I don't think that's what Socrates believes. He definitely thinks something's curious about it, but more so the idea that the performer is crazy or the performer is mad. Okay, last question. According to the passage, Homer is inspired by, okay, so before I even go to the answer, I want to think about where I read about or what the main idea of this passage is. It's that Socrates and Ion are at odds with each other, and Ion is a rhapsode. Oops. Socrates and Ion at odds with each other, and Ion, who is Ion? He's a rhapsode that loves Homer. All right, so let's look at the answer choices. According to the passage, Homer is inspired by A, Socrates. All right, so Socrates he's not a rhapsode, he's just a philosopher, and he's at odds with Ion. And it doesn't really seem like Homer as a poet would take any inspiration from a philosopher. Earlier on in the passage, they talked about this link about how it goes from God to poet to the rhapsode. So it looks more like the poet would take inspiration from God, not necessarily Socrates. So we can cross out Socrates. B, Ion. So again, not what we saw here, right? The rhapsode takes inspiration from the poet, and Ion loves poet, but we don't know if it goes the other way. So it doesn't look like Homer's gonna be inspired by Ion. C, God. So that's what we predicted. That's what we thought of to be the answer. So we can highlight that. That looks like what our answer is probably shaping up to be. D, Epidaurus. I don't really remember who Epidaurus is. They didn't mention that, and I mean, he wasn't really important enough to mention too many times in the passage. So, and we already know we have good text evidence that Homer is probably inspired by God as a poet. So we can go ahead and knock out Epidaurus and confirm C is our answer. All right, so that was this CARS passage. I really do hope that was helpful for you all. And if you would like to watch other videos, we have a ton of other ones on our channel that would be very useful for you guys. We have a lot of resources online on our website as well. But again, hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for joining me and have a great rest of your day.